club that I may belong to.
There's a whole nother life if you're black. There's a whole layer that people don't see or don't appreciate in terms of what you have to do to just make it through every day.
This whole history of white rioting and white violence historically buried. People think of violence and riots in the street. They always think of the 1960s when black people rioted, but when white people rioted, it doesn't even have a name.
There's still large segments of the country that are not going to first evaluate what I do, but they're just going to make snap judgments because my skin is not white.
I'm Bob Herbert. For nearly half a century, I've covered important issues to face the American people. As a reporter and a columnist at the Daily News in New York, at NBC News, and at the New York Times. This is a story about race, about persistent, depraved, often murderous racial prejudice and discrimination, and especially how that racism has affected the black middle class. The United States views a strong middle class, not just as an ideal, but as its proudest creation. But the black middle class is not and never has been the same as the white middle class. Whites talk about working hard and playing by the rules, but blacks have always had to play by a different, hateful set of hideously unfair rules. Working hard has never been enough for black Americans to flourish. Nearly 40% of all black children in America are poor. The black unemployment rate is twice that of whites. And the black middle class is far more fragile and has much less wealth than the white middle class. In fact, blacks are not even in the same league with whites when it comes to wealth. For every dollar of wealth in the hands of the average white family in America, the typical black family has just a little more than a nickel. Why these terrible disparities are still the case, a century and a half after slavery and a half century after the heyday of the civil rights movement, is what I'll try to explain in this documentary. It's not easy to get a handle on black America. There are an awful lot of African Americans doing awfully well.
This is for you, Billy.
Cultural heroes are commonplace. Black stars are dominant in the sports world. And there are fabulously successful African Americans in media and fine art.
The door tonight has been opened.
And of course, Barack Obama was elected to 2 terms as president. But at the same time, black America has been racked by terrible poverty, much tragic violence, and disastrous relations with law enforcement at every level.
I can't breathe! Oh my God, I'm dead.
Where does the middle class fit into this picture?
I think the perception of blacks in general is on TV. You have both ends of the spectrum. You see folks who are very poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods, or you see the blacks that are uber wealthy like you see on TV. There's nobody in the middle they have a nice home, they make a decent living, but they're not uber rich. And I think the perception is that there is no middle for us. I think the ones in the middle just kind of get dismissed or negated out.
But you're real.
Only has $5,700. That's a pretty devastating gap.
80% of African Americans have a net worth below the median net worth of white Americans.
80%.
80%. Meaning that fundamentally, the notion of economic stability that middle connotes is something towards.
We have to take a look back. early part of the 20th century, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. To say that they were oppressed, treated cruelly, is an understatement. They were treated as if they were subhuman. Elijah Cummings is a U.S. congressman from Maryland. He's also the son and grandson of Southern sharecroppers. Cummings and his wife, Dr. Maya Rockymore, are exploring his family's origins in South Carolina.
Meaning he had to have been born
In slavery, right, Isaac.
Isaiah was born in 1885, right after.
Isaiah Cummings was my grandfather, and he fell sick on a Sunday. And they brought him home, and some kind of way they got two doctors that would come out, and two white doctors, an old one and a younger one. And so the young doctor said, you know, we need to really get this man to a hospital or else he's going to die. And the older white doctor said, don't worry about him, he's only a nigger. Oh. And that night, my grandfather died. And my father, to his death, I think was very upset about that.
Slavery ended, but things didn't change. People still lived on land that was owned by others. They still worked for profits that went to others. Working conditions were harsh. Children weren't getting educated. There was a lot of illness, early death, and people didn't see a way out. Sharecropping was nothing but slavery under a different name, and that was the status of a lot of black people.
The majority who were doing sharecropping never cleared anything at the end of the year. So that this is something that kept people in debt to the landowner and debt to the planter, which meant that, for all intents and purposes, they were not much better off than their enslaved ancestors had been.
My grandmother's house was basically a wood cabin, and literally you could look through the floor and see the ground. My father would work from sunup to sundown, plowing fields, picking cotton, strawberries, tobacco. He was truly a sharecropping farmer, and back then got very, very little per day.
Sharecroppers offered no money. They were cheated by landowners and had virtually no legal recourse.
They would take the kids to work the fields. To work the fields. You wouldn't. We would talk right through all this. Somebody had to plow this land.
And they shut down the schools during harvest time so that the kids could come out and help with the harvest.
It's hard to imagine the growth of a healthy black middle class from this wretched soil.
There are many examples of Southern governors and lawmakers who would say, well, what would be the point of investing in education for these people who, when all we need them to be is a cook or domestic or to work in the field, how much education could they need?
James K. Vardaman was explicit on that point. Governor of Mississippi and then U.S. Senator in the early 1900s, he had sworn to lynch every black person in the state, if necessary, to maintain white supremacy. The only effect of Negro education, Vardaman said, was to spoil a good field hand and make an insolent cook.
It was a regime of totalitarianism in some ways.
Whatever you had could be taken away the moment some white woman accused a black man of looking at her the wrong way. A white family thought that a black family was doing too well, getting uppity. People tried to exercise a few rights, suggested they had them. Any of these things could get you.
It was against the law for a black person and a white person to just put records together in Birmingham. Everything you could imagine was segregated. There were separate staircases. There were separate taxi cabs. And so that meant that at every turn, at every moment, every single thing that you did, you had to be keenly aware and observant and vigilant as to where you happened to be and making sure you were not crossing the line. Any breach of that caste system could mean injury, attack, and even death.
Klux Klan.
And always there was the violence.
They terrorized Negroes and their sympathizers with violence, arson, and murder.
They took them and put them in jail and they beat them. And then they got together on a Saturday around the neck and put the father on one side of the bumper and the Negro and the son on the other side of the bumper. They drug them all over the town. And after that, they were drugged through the neighborhood, the Negro neighborhood. They were told that this is the way that we're going to keep the Negro in this place.
A teacher in Florida named Harry T. Moore tried to fight back against. In January 1944, he learned about a black teenage boy who had the temerity to send a Christmas card to a white girl. After she showed the card to her father, and a group of his angry friends gathered, they and forced his head and tortured him, then drowned him in a river. Moore, founder of the local NAACP, and his wife Harriet spent their adult lives battling such outrages. They fought against mob violence, equal pay for black teachers. At great personal peril, they tried to get people registered to vote. Both were fired from their teaching jobs and blacklisted. They were not safe anywhere, least of all in their own home in rural Mims, Florida. On Christmas night, 1951, the Moores' 25th wedding anniversary, a bomb exploded under their bedroom as they slept. They were taken to a hospital 35 miles away. By the time the only available black doctor could be located, Harry T. Moore had died, her husband. 8 days later, she also died. Even in that violent, hateful, repressive environment, some faint stirrings of a black middle class could be felt.
You had African American professionals and funeral parlors and undertakers. They served the African American community. Their jobs and livelihood did not depend on working for a white company, a white family, or a white institution.
Mario's mother, Sybil, a teacher and community leader in New Orleans, grew up in that environment.
We had a very comfortable life in this bubble where we were protected because we were among our own and dependent on our own. And there was a lot of entertaining. I guess we mimicked the white society. My mother entertained with organizations like the Lynx and the Boulay. But you were inside this secure bubble, and you stepped beyond, and it was another world. You knew your limitations. When a white person was walking on the sidewalk and a black would be walking toward them, they had to step down off the curb to let the white person pass. You knew what not to do. You knew not to step beyond the Louisiana laws.
But blacks who improved their lot were always at risk. A small enclave of prosperous black entrepreneurs in Tulsa, Oklahoma, became known as the Negro Wall Street. They had their own shops, banks, newspapers, restaurants, and theaters, the makings of a self-sustaining middle class. But in May 1921, riots broke out when blacks tried to stop an angry white mob from lynching a young black man. Black homes and businesses were attacked with firebombs and gunfire, and the National Guard was called up. The violence lasted 16 hours. When it was over, the Negro Wall Street was wiped out.
South, they tried to stay in the South, and after a while, they were just done. Lynchings were still happening, were still very much there, but equal. of people just said, let's just go north.
They came out of the South by the millions in search of a better life for themselves and their children. They carried very little besides the clothes on their back, a package with just enough food for their journey, and a dream. Unnoticed by most journalists, unacknowledged by early historians, their journey came to be known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was an outpouring of 6 million African Americans from the South to the North, the Midwest, and West. It was a search for freedom, a search for the ability to pursue their dreams for both themselves and for their children.
Their main objective was paid employment.
In the first part of the last century, the labor force, certainly of white males, was being siphoned off into the war effort.
Well, they were recruiting. The northern businesses, the northern industries, railroads, and the factories and the steel mills of the north needed labor, and they went to the south to find them because they were looking for the cheapest labor in the land, which would have meant African Americans. When the recruiters came, they actually had to take great care in doing so, because it turned out that there was great resistance in the South to this poaching.
Resistance among whites.
Yes.
Whites in the South did not want blacks to leave.
They did not want the labor to leave.
We have a good set of Negroes here, and they don't want to be disturbed. Of course, there are some getting some ideas, and that's all right. That's progress. But we've got some mighty good darkies here.
The Great Migration was the largest internal migration in America's history.
There are a lot of legendary railroad lines that we associate with the Great Migration now. The Illinois Central city of New Orleans is one of the most legendary railroad routes. There were 3 streams that the people used to escape. One was up the East Coast, which carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, and New York, up the East Coast of our country. And then there was the Midwest stream from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Minneapolis. And then there was the West Coast stream, which carried people from Texas and Louisiana out to California, and then all the way up to Washington State and even beyond. Some people drove all the way out, particularly when they went out to the West Coast. It could be Jim Crow extended beyond the borders of the South. In many cases where if they were driving, they had to be very cautious. There were lots of places where they could not necessarily be assured of getting gas, could not be assured of getting a room for the night, could not be assured of being able to get food or to be able to eat it in a restaurant. So there were lots of obstacles and barriers that they had to overcome.
People didn't know that they were trading a challenging situation, a difficult situation, a harsh situation in the South, indeed, for a new form of discrimination and exclusion, indeed, in the North.
For one thing, the promise of good jobs was vastly overstated. Some blacks found lower echelon work in the face of industrial cities. Most, the only option was menial labor, sometimes of the most humiliating variety. This humiliation, accepted as normal by most, was often captured in the popular entertainment of the time.
Any more sandwiches?
Oh, sure, I got lots of them. Good night, Miss Williams.
Black people really weren't allowed to get really good jobs. Domestic work overwhelmingly is what black women did.
My mother, she worked in a pickle factory, if I recall it correctly. And then she did a lot of domestic work. Dad was a laborer, lifting drums, breathing chemicals all day.
Men participated in all sorts of, whether it was cutting grass, gardening, cooks, drivers, janitorial workers. The jobs that were at the very bottom of the economy substantially were held by African Americans. A good job was being a Pullman car porter.
Blacks considered Pullman porter to be a middle-class job.
The thing that made it middle class was that they were being paid relatively well, particularly compared to other African Americans, and they had a uniform and they were moving about with, important and respected people. So it was a revered occupation to have, and yet it's an indication that still, essentially, these were people who were servants.
For a lot of blacks, the only route to a decent job was self-employment. My family was a family of tradespeople. They were upholsterers. My mother was a seamstress. My father was an upholsterer. My grandfather was an upholsterer. I cannot believe that my grandfather's old upholstery shop is now this boutique restaurant. It used to say R.S. Herbert Upholstering, established 1927. This store right here, I came in and out of that door a million times when I was like, 7, 8, 9 years old, right on up through high school. I used to work here after school. This place was really important to my family because my grandfather owned the shop during the Depression, and he had 5 kids, and it kept his family from being destitute. In those days in Montclair, if you were black, there was not much in the form of gainful employment to be had. But if you had a business, that was different. My grandfather had a business. Largely shut out of private employment, the real route to the middle class for overwhelming numbers of blacks was government employment, as teachers in black neighborhoods, for example, or lower-level municipal workers, or in the post office.
The post office not only offered